The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban street as Angela Morrison drove slowly through Maple Ridge, a neighborhood she'd never visited before. She was tired after spending the weekend with her mother, helping the 78-year-old woman organize her medication and fix a leaky faucet. These monthly visits had become more important lately, especially since her father passed away 2 years ago. Angela glanced at her GPS, making sure she was taking the right route back to the highway. The houses here were beautiful, large colonial homes with perfectly manicured lawns and expensive cars in the driveways. She couldn't help but notice how different this area looked compared to the neighborhood where she grew up. But that was 25 years ago, and she'd worked hard to get where she was today. At 45, Angela had dedicated her entire career to law enforcement. She started as a beat cop in Detroit, then worked her way up through narcotics, federal task forces, and eventually earned her law degree while working full-time. 6 months ago, she'd been appointed as director of the Drug Enforcement Administration, making her one of the most powerful people in federal law enforcement. But right now, she was just a daughter driving home after visiting her mom. The blue and red lights in her rearview mirror caught her attention suddenly. Angela's heart sank as she realized a police car was following her. She hadn't been speeding. She'd been extra careful about that since she was in an unfamiliar area. She pulled over carefully, turning off the radio and placing her hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. Officer Jake Sullivan stepped out of his patrol car with the confidence of someone who'd done this thousands of times before. At 52, he'd been working this beat for over 15 years and thought he knew every face in Maple Ridge. When he saw the black sedan driving slowly through the neighborhood, something felt off to him. The car was expensive, but the driver didn't look like she belonged here. Sullivan approached the driver's side window, his hand resting casually on his belt. When Angela rolled down the window, he leaned down slightly, his expression already showing suspicion. "Good morning, officer," Angela said politely, keeping her voice calm and respectful. Years of experience had taught her that these situations could go wrong quickly, regardless of who she was or what she did for a living. "License and registration," Sullivan said without returning the greeting. "You know why I stopped you?" Angela reached slowly for her purse, making sure to announce her movements. "I'm getting my license from my purse now," she said clearly. "Honestly, officer, I'm not sure why you stopped me. I was being very careful about the speed limit." Sullivan watched her movements closely, his eyes narrowing as he took in her appearance. She was well-dressed, driving a car that probably cost more than his annual salary, and she spoke like she was educated. In his experience, people like her in this neighborhood usually meant trouble. "You were driving suspiciously," he said, taking her license. "Moving real slow, looking around like you're casing houses. This is a quiet neighborhood, and residents have been complaining about break-ins lately." Angela felt her stomach tighten. She'd heard these words before, not directed at her personally, but in countless reports and complaints that crossed her desk. The assumption was always the same: a black person in an affluent area must be up to no good. "I was just trying to follow my GPS, officer," she explained patiently. "I'm not familiar with this area, so I was driving carefully to make sure I didn't miss my turn." Sullivan barely glanced at her license before handing it back. "Angela Morrison," he read aloud. "What brings you to Maple Ridge, Miss Morrison? You got family here?" "Friends? I was visiting my mother about 20 minutes away, and I'm heading home," Angela replied. "My GPS routed me through this neighborhood to get back to the highway." "Yeah, huh?" Sullivan's tone suggested he didn't believe a word she was saying. What kind of work do you do that lets you afford a car like this?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Angela knew exactly what he was implying. She could feel the familiar anger rising in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. Getting upset would only make things worse. "I work for the federal government," she said simply. Sullivan let out a short laugh. "Federal government, huh? What department?" "You work at the post office?" The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. Angela took a deep breath, reminding herself that she'd dealt with officers like Sullivan her entire career. Some people couldn't see past their own prejudices, no matter what evidence was right in front of them. "I work in law enforcement," she said, hoping that might change his attitude. But Sullivan's expression only became more skeptical. "Law enforcement? Like what, security guard? Courthouse clerk?" Angela realized that nothing she said was going to convince this man to treat her with basic respect. She could show him her federal credentials, but something told her he'd find a way to dismiss those too. So she decided to wait and see how far his assumptions would take him. "Something like that," she said quietly. Sullivan stepped back from the car and spoke into his radio. "Dispatch, I need you to run a plate for me." He rattled off her license, plate number, and waited for the response. When it came back clean, he seemed almost disappointed. He walked around her car slowly, looking for any excuse to continue the stop. The windows were tinted but legal. The registration was current. Everything was in order, but Sullivan wasn't ready to let her go. His instincts told him something wasn't right about this situation. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," he said, returning to her window. Angela's heart rate increased. This was escalating beyond a simple traffic stop, and she knew from experience that arguing would only make things worse. But she also knew her rights. "May I ask why, officer?" "I've provided my license and registration, and you said everything." Checked out, Sullivan's jaw tightened. He didn't like being questioned, especially by someone he'd already decided was trouble. "I don't need to explain myself to you. Step out of the car, now." Angela complied, moving slowly and keeping her hands visible. As she stood beside her car, she noticed a few neighbors had come out of their houses to watch the scene unfold. Some were talking quietly among themselves, and at least one person appeared to be recording with their phone. "Turn around in place." "Your hands on the hood," Sullivan instructed. This was going too far, and Angela knew it. She was being treated like a criminal for no reason other than driving through a neighborhood while black. But she also knew that resisting or arguing would only escalate the situation further. As she placed her hands on the warm metal of her car hood, Angela thought about all the young people she'd mentored over the years, all the speeches she'd given about staying calm during police encounters, and all the reports she'd read about situations just like this one. She never imagined she'd find herself on the receiving end of such treatment. Despite her position and years of service, Sullivan called for backup, convinced he was about to uncover something significant. In his mind, Angela's calm demeanor and expensive possessions only confirmed his suspicions. People didn't act this composed unless they had something to hide. Angela stood quietly, her mind racing through her options while maintaining the dignity that had carried her through countless challenges in her career. She had no idea that this moment would soon become a turning point, not just for her, but for the entire community watching from their windows and sidewalks. Officer Sullivan stepped back and looked at Angela more carefully. Something about her bothered him, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what. She was too calm, too composed for someone who'd just been pulled over. Most people got nervous, or started talking too much when they found themselves in this situation. But this woman just stood there with her hands on the car, waiting patiently like she'd been through this before. Her car was what really caught his attention, though. A black Mercedes sedan, probably worth more than his house. The leather interior looked spotless, and he could see expensive sunglasses sitting on the dashboard. Her clothes weren't cheap either, a well-tailored blazer and pants that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. Sullivan had been a cop long enough to develop what he called his street sense. In his mind, when someone who looked like her had this kind of money, it usually came from one place. And it wasn't from working a regular job at some government office like she claimed. "Nice car," he said, walking around the Mercedes again. "Must have cost you quite a bit. Government work pays that well these days?" Angela kept her voice steady. "I've worked hard for many years, officer. I'm fortunate to have a good position." Sullivan peered through the windows, looking for anything suspicious. "Mind if I ask what kind of government work?" Because I know what federal employees make around here, and it ain't Mercedes money. The implication in his voice was clear, and Angela felt her jaw tighten slightly. She'd spent her entire career fighting the drug trade, putting dealers and traffickers behind bars, sometimes risking her life to keep communities safe. And now, she was being treated like a criminal herself, all because of assumptions based on her appearance and possessions. I work in federal law enforcement, she repeated, her patience wearing thin despite her best efforts to stay calm. Sullivan laughed, but there was no humor in it. Law enforcement? Right, let me guess, you're undercover, and that's why you're driving around rich neighborhoods in a fancy car? Before Angela could respond, Sullivan's backup arrived. Officer Rodriguez pulled up in his patrol car, stepping out with a questioning look. He was younger than Sullivan, maybe in his early 30s, and Angela noticed he seemed less aggressive in his approach. What have we got here, Jake? Rodriguez asked, looking between Sullivan and Angela. Found this one cruising through Maple Ridge, acting suspicious, Sullivan explained. Claims she works for the federal government, but look at that car. Something doesn't add up. Rodriguez glanced at the Mercedes, then at Angela. Something felt off about the whole situation to him, but Sullivan was his senior officer, and he'd learned not to question him too openly. Have you searched the vehicle yet? Rodriguez asked. Sullivan shook his head. Just about to. I can smell marijuana coming from inside the car. Angela's eyes widened. Excuse me, officer, but that's not true. I don't use marijuana, and there's none in my vehicle. I know what I smell, Sullivan said firmly. He turned to Rodriguez. You smell it too, right? Rodriguez hesitated. He didn't smell anything unusual, but he could see Sullivan was determined to search the car. I think I might, he said reluctantly. Angela realized the situation was spiraling out of control. These officers were clearly planning to search her car based on a false claim, and she knew that once they started down this path, anything could happen. She'd seen too many cases where evidence was planted or situations were manufactured to justify illegal searches. Officers, I need to inform you that I have federal identification in my purse that proves my employment, she said, trying to keep her voice professional. I'd like to show it to you before this goes any further. Sullivan waved dismissively. Save it, I've heard every story in the book. Federal agent, FBI, everybody's got some kind of badge these days. You can show me whatever fake ID you want after we search your car. The casual way he dismissed her credentials sent a chill down Angela's spine. In her position, she was used to commanding respect from law enforcement officers across the country. She'd worked with local police departments, state agencies, and federal task forces. She'd given speeches at police academies and law enforcement conferences. And now she was being treated like her word meant nothing. I assure you my credentials are legitimate, she said, her voice getting slightly firmer. And I do not consent to a search of my vehicle. Sullivan's expression hardened. Well, that's too bad because I smell drugs, which gives me probable cause. You can cooperate or make this harder on yourself, but either way, we're searching this car. A small crowd had gathered across the street. Angela could see neighbors peering from their windows, and several people had their phones out, recording the encounter. She wondered what they were thinking, whether they saw an innocent woman being harassed, or whether they assumed she must have done something wrong to warrant this treatment. Sullivan opened the driver's side door and began looking through the interior. He checked the glove compartment, under the seats, and in the door panels. Rodriguez stood nearby, looking increasingly uncomfortable as the search continued without finding anything. Jake, Rodriguez said quietly, maybe we should just write her a warning and let her go. We're not finding anything. But Sullivan was in too deep now. He'd made his accusations in front of backup and witnesses. If he let Angela go without finding something, it would look like he'd made a mistake, and his pride wouldn't allow that. Keep looking, he told Rodriguez. People who drive cars like this, in neighborhoods like this, when they don't belong here, they're hiding something. Trust me. Angela watched as Sullivan moved to the trunk of her car. Inside was her gym bag. From the weekend, a small cooler her mother had packed with leftovers and some work files she'd brought home to review. Normal things that any person might have in their car. Sullivan opened her gym bag and went through it piece by piece. Her workout clothes, sneakers, a water bottle, and some protein bars. He seemed frustrated that everything was so ordinary. "What's in here?" he asked, pointing to a small zipper pocket in the bag. "Vitamins and supplements," Angela replied. "Multivitamins, vitamin D, things like that." Sullivan unzipped the pocket and pulled out several small bottles. Angela's heart sank as she watched him examine them. She knew how this could look to someone who was determined to find fault. "Vitamin D, huh?" Sullivan said, holding up one of the bottles. "These look like pills to me. How do I know these aren't drugs?" "Because they're clearly labeled," Angela said, her frustration finally starting to show. "They're over-the-counter supplements from a pharmacy. The labels show exactly what they are." But Sullivan was already calling it in. "Dispatch, I need a field test kit out here. We've got suspected controlled substances." Rodriguez looked at the vitamin bottles and then at Angela. Something was seriously wrong here. These were clearly legitimate supplements, the kind anyone might have in their gym bag. But Sullivan seemed determined to escalate the situation no matter what they found. Angela closed her eyes for a moment, trying to process what was happening. In a few hours, she would need to be back in Washington, making decisions that affected law enforcement agencies across the entire country. She had meetings scheduled with senators, briefings to give to the Attorney General, and a conference call with DEA field offices in 6 different states. But right now, she was just another black woman being treated like a criminal for no reason other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time, in the eyes of an officer who had already made up his mind about who she was and what she represented. The field test kit would take another 20 minutes to arrive, which meant she'd be standing here even longer, subject to the stares and whispers of people who were forming their own judgments about what they were. Witnessing. Sullivan continued his search with renewed determination, convinced he was on the verge of a major bust that would validate all his suspicions. 20 minutes felt like hours as Angela stood beside her car, watching Officer Sullivan grow more frustrated with each passing moment. The field test kit had arrived, and he tested her vitamins twice, each time getting the same result: negative for any controlled substances. But instead of admitting his mistake, Sullivan seemed more determined than ever to prove he was right. "These tests aren't always accurate," he muttered to Officer Rodriguez, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the entire situation. "Sometimes you need to send things to the lab for proper testing." Rodriguez had been a police officer for 8 years, and he'd never seen his partner behave this way during a routine traffic stop. The woman they'd pulled over had been nothing but polite and cooperative, yet Sullivan was treating her like she was a major drug dealer. Something wasn't adding up. "Jake," Rodriguez said quietly, pulling Sullivan aside, "maybe we should wrap this up. We've been here for almost an hour, and we haven't found anything. The neighbors are starting to complain about the commotion." Indeed, the small crowd across the street had grown larger. Some residents had come out of their houses to see what was happening, and several people were openly recording the encounter with their phones. A few had even started talking among themselves, questioning why the police were spending so much time on what appeared to be a simple traffic stop, but Sullivan wasn't ready to give up. In his mind, Angela's calm demeanor throughout the entire ordeal only confirmed his suspicions. Innocent people got upset when they were falsely accused. They cried, they protested, they demanded to call lawyers. This woman just stood there, patient and composed, like she was used to dealing with law enforcement. That had to mean something. "One more check," Sullivan told Rodriguez. "I want to look through her purse more carefully. And I want to see that federal ID she keeps talking about." Angela had been waiting for this moment. Her federal credentials were in her wallet, along with her D badge and identification card that clearly stated her position as Director of the Drug Enforcement Administration. She'd been hoping Sullivan would ask to see them earlier, before the situation got so out of hand. "Officer, I've been trying to show you my identification for the past hour," Angela said, her patience finally wearing thin. "My federal credentials are in my wallet in my purse." Sullivan approached her with a skeptical expression. Alright, let's see this fake ID you've been talking about. But I'm warning you, if you try to run or make any sudden movements, this situation is going to get a lot worse for you. Angela slowly reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet. As she opened it, she could see Sullivan preparing to dismiss whatever she was about to show him. He'd already made up his mind that anything she produced would be fake or stolen. She handed him her D credentials first, a leather case containing her official badge and identification card. Sullivan took it casually, expecting to find some cheap knockoff or novelty item that he could use to justify arresting her for impersonating a federal agent, but as he opened the case, his expression began to change. The badge looked real, the weight, the detail, the official seals. He examined it more closely, turning it over in his hands. Then he looked at the identification card. The photo was clearly Angela, and the name matched her driver's license. But it was the title that made his blood run cold. Director, Drug Enforcement Administration. Sullivan stared at the ID for a long moment, reading it again to make sure he wasn't seeing things. Director of the DEA, the head of the federal agency, responsible for fighting drug crimes across the entire United States. The woman he'd been treating like a common criminal for the past hour was one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. His hands started to shake slightly as the full implications of what he'd done began to sink in. He'd accused the director of the DEA of drug possession. He'd searched her car based on false claims about smelling marijuana. He'd treated her with disrespect and suspicion, all because he'd made assumptions based on her race and appearance. This can't be real, Sullivan stammered, but even as he said it, he knew it was. The credentials were too detailed, too official to be fake. And suddenly, Angela's calm demeanor throughout the entire encounter made perfect sense. She wasn't acting like a criminal because she wasn't one. She was acting like a seasoned law enforcement professional because that's exactly what she was. Rodriguez noticed the change in Sullivan's expression and moved closer. What is it, Jake? What's wrong? Sullivan couldn't speak. He just handed Rodriguez the credentials, watching as his partner's face went through the same progression of shock and disbelief. Oh my God, Rodriguez whispered, looking from the ID to Angela and back again. You're actually the director of the D. Angela nodded calmly. Yes, I am. I tried to tell Officer Sullivan this earlier, but he wasn't interested in listening. The words hit Sullivan like a physical blow. Every assumption he'd made, every accusation he'd leveled, every disrespectful comment, it had all been directed at someone whose job it was to oversee drug enforcement operations across the entire nation. Someone who probably knew more about fighting drug crimes than he'd learned in 10 lifetimes. Rodriguez was staring at Sullivan in horror, realizing that his partner had just created what could be the biggest scandal in their department's history. They detained and searched the director of the D based on nothing more than racial profiling and false assumptions. Ma'am, quote Rodriguez started, but he couldn't find the words. How do you apologize for something like this? How do you explain that your partner had accused one of the country's top law enforcement officials of being a drug dealer? Angela looked at both officers, her expression unreadable. She could see the panic in their eyes as they realized the magnitude of their mistake. Sullivan looked like he might be sick, while Rodriguez seemed to be calculating how much trouble they were all in. The crowd across the street had grown even larger, and Angela could see people pointing and talking excitedly. Some were still recording, and she knew that videos of this encounter would probably be online within hours. The story of a D director being racially profiled and searched for drugs would make national news before the day was over. Officers, Angela said quietly, I think we need to discuss how we're going to handle this situation. Sullivan finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Director Morrison, I made a mistake. I'm sorry. I thought ... You thought what, Officer Sullivan? Angela asked, her tone still professional but with an edge that hadn't been there before. You thought that a black woman driving through a nice neighborhood must be a drug dealer? You thought that my federal credentials were fake? You thought that vitamins in my gym bag were controlled substances? Each question hit Sullivan like A hammer blow. There was no way to explain his actions that didn't sound like textbook racial profiling. He'd let his prejudices and assumptions drive his behavior, and now he was facing the consequences. Rodriguez was frantically trying to think of ways to minimize the damage. Director Morrison, is there any way we can resolve this quietly? My partner made an error in judgment, but I'm sure we can work something out. Angela looked at Rodriguez for a long moment. She could make this entire incident disappear with a phone call. She could have both officers transferred or disciplined, quietly, without any public attention. She could protect the department's reputation and avoid the media circus that would inevitably follow if this story got out. But as she stood there, thinking about all the young black men and women who didn't have her position or influence, who got pulled over and searched and humiliated without any recourse, she realized she couldn't just let this slide. "Officer Rodriguez," she said finally, "I appreciate your concern, but what happened here today isn't just about me. It's about a pattern of behavior that affects countless innocent people who don't have the luxury of federal credentials to protect them." Sullivan's career flashed before his eyes. 15 years on the force, his pension, his reputation, all of it could be gone because he'd let his biases control his actions. He wanted to beg, to plead for understanding, but he knew there was nothing he could say that would undo what he'd done. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, as more police units responded to what they thought was a drug bust in progress. Instead, they were about to arrive at the scene of one of the most embarrassing incidents in their department's history. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity that Sullivan would later describe as the worst day of his 15-year career. Within minutes of the revelation, 3 more patrol cars had arrived at the scene, their officers expecting to assist with a major drug arrest. Instead, they found their colleague pale and shaking. Standing next to the director of the Drug Enforcement Administration, Captain Davis arrived shortly after, having been called by Rodriguez in a panic-filled phone. Call that barely made sense. As the senior officer at the scene, Davis had seen plenty of difficult situations during his 23 years on the force, but nothing had prepared him for this. "Let me understand this correctly," Captain Davis said, pulling Sullivan aside, while Rodriguez gave him a briefing. "You pulled over the director of the D, accused her of drug possession, searched her vehicle without proper cause, and detained her for over an hour." Sullivan could only nod, unable to meet his captain's eyes. The weight of his actions was crushing him, and he knew that no explanation would make this situation better. Meanwhile, Angela stood beside her car watching the chaos unfold around her. Several officers had approached her with apologies, their faces showing the embarrassment they felt on behalf of their department. She accepted their words graciously, but her mind was already working through the implications of what had happened. As director of the D, Angela understood better than most how these incidents affected communities. She'd read countless reports about racial profiling, sat through briefings about community relations, and worked with civil rights organizations to improve police practices. But experiencing it firsthand was entirely different from reading about it. In reports, her phone had been buzzing constantly since she'd turned it back on. Word was already spreading through law enforcement circles, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the media picked up the story. She had 3 missed calls from her deputy director, 2 from the Attorney General's office, and at least a dozen text messages from colleagues who'd heard rumors about what happened. "Captain," Davis approached her with the kind of respect that should have been shown from the beginning. "Director Morrison, I want to personally apologize for what happened here today. Officer Sullivan's actions do not represent the values of our department." Angela studied the captain's face, seeing genuine regret and concern. She appreciated his words, but she also knew that apologies wouldn't be enough to address the larger issues at play. "Captain Davis, I appreciate your apology," she said, "but I think we both know this isn't just about one officer making a mistake. This is about systemic problems that need to be addressed." Davis nodded gravely. He'd been dreading this conversation, knowing that Angela was absolutely right. Sullivan's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that the department had been struggling with for years. By the time Angela was finally free to leave, nearly 2 hours after the initial traffic stop, the story was already making its way onto social media. Several witnesses had posted videos of the encounter, and local news stations were scrambling to confirm the details. The headline on the evening news was exactly what Angela had expected: director racially profiled and searched by local police. The story led every newscast in the area, and by morning it had gone national. Angela watched the coverage from her home office, seeing her own face on television as reporters discussed the incident. The videos taken by bystanders showed the entire encounter, from Sullivan's aggressive questioning to his obvious shock when he realized who she was. The footage spoke for itself, leaving little room for alternative interpretations of what had happened. Her phone rang constantly throughout the evening. Reporters wanted statements, civil rights organizations wanted to discuss legal action, and politicians wanted to express their outrage. Angela listened to each caller carefully, but she wasn't ready to make any public statements yet. She needed time to think about how to handle this situation in a way that would create positive change. At the police station, Sullivan sat in Captain Davis's office, staring at the disciplinary paperwork in front of him. The department's Internal Affairs Division had already opened an investigation, and he knew that his career was effectively over. Even if he somehow kept his job, he'd never live down the humiliation of what he'd done. "Jake, I've got to ask you," Captain Davis said, leaning back in his chair. "What were you thinking? You've been a cop for 15 years. You know better than this." Sullivan struggled to find words that would explain his actions without making them sound even worse. "I thought she looked suspicious, Captain. The expensive car, the way she was driving through the neighborhood. I've seen it before with drug dealers." "So you assumed she was a criminal because she was black and had a nice car?" Davis asked bluntly. The question hung in the air like an accusation, because that's exactly what it was. Sullivan had made assumptions based on race and stereotypes, and those assumptions had led him to treat an innocent person, a fellow law enforcement officer, like a criminal. "I made a mistake," Sullivan said quietly, "a big one." Davis shook his head. "This isn't just a mistake, Jake. This is a career-ending decision that's going to cost all of us. The lawsuits, the media attention, the damage to our reputation, it's going to take years to recover from this." Across town, Angela was having her own difficult conversations. Her deputy director had driven over to discuss the situation, and they spent hours talking about how to respond to the inevitable public pressure. "The Attorney General wants to meet with you tomorrow," Deputy Director Williams said. "There's going to be pressure for a federal investigation into the entire department." Angela nodded. She'd expected this. When the head of a federal agency was subjected to racial profiling, it became more than just a local incident. It became a national issue that demanded a federal response. "What are you thinking about doing?" Williams asked carefully. Angela looked out her window, thinking about all the people who had experienced what she'd gone through but didn't have her platform or influence to fight back. "I'm thinking about using this as an opportunity to create real change," she said finally. The next morning, Angela woke up to find protesters gathering outside the Maple Ridge Police Department. Civil rights organizations had organized quickly, and dozens of people were carrying signs demanding justice and accountability. The local news was covering the demonstration live, interviewing community members who shared their own experiences with racial profiling. She also received a call from the mayor's office, asking if she would be willing to meet with city officials to discuss the situation. Angela agreed, but she made it clear that any meeting would need to include community representatives and civil rights leaders. By afternoon, the incident had become a trending topic on social media. People were sharing the videos, discussing their own experiences with police, and debating what should happen to Officer Sullivan. Some called for his immediate firing, while others argued for criminal charges. Angela found herself at the center of a national conversation about race, policing, and justice. It wasn't a position she'd asked for, but she realized it was an opportunity to make a difference on issues she'd cared about throughout her career. That evening, She sat down to write. Her first public statement about the incident. She knew that her words would be scrutinized and analyzed, that they could either help heal the community or make the divisions worse. As she began typing, Angela thought about the young black professionals who would see her story and recognize their own fears and experiences. She thought about the police officers who would be embarrassed by Sullivan's actions and want to do better. And she thought about the community members who deserved to feel safe and respected by the people sworn to protect them. Her statement would be the first step in a long process of accountability and change, but Angela was determined to make sure that something positive came from one of the most humiliating experiences of her life. 3 months after the incident that made national headlines, Angela Morrison's black Mercedes sedan pulled into the same Maple Ridge neighborhood where she'd been humiliated and searched. This time, however, she wasn't alone. A convoy of vehicles followed her, carrying federal agents, local officials, and community leaders who had come to witness something remarkable. The house where the community meeting was being held belonged to Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who had watched the entire incident unfold from her front porch. She'd been one of the people recording that day, and her video had become one of the most widely shared pieces of evidence showing what had really happened. "I never thought I'd see the day," Mrs. Patterson said, welcoming Angela into her living room. "When I watched that officer treat you so badly, I was ashamed of my own neighborhood. But look at us now. The transformation hadn't happened overnight." In the weeks following the incident, Angela had made a decision that surprised many people. Instead of filing lawsuits or demanding immediate punishment for Officer Sullivan, she chose a different path. She saw an opportunity to create lasting change that would benefit communities far beyond Maple Ridge. Angela had spent countless hours meeting with community leaders, police officials, and civil rights organizations. She'd listened to stories from dozens of people who had experienced similar treatment, and she'd worked with experts to develop a comprehensive program that could address the root causes of racial bias in policing. The result was the Community Trust Initiative, a groundbreaking program that Angela had piloted right here in Maple Ridge. It combined bias training, community engagement, and accountability measures in ways that had never been tried before. Officer Sullivan was in the room that evening, though. He looked very different from the confident cop who had pulled Angela over 3 months earlier. The internal investigation had resulted in a 6-month suspension without pay, mandatory bias training, and a permanent mark on his record. But more importantly, Sullivan had volunteered to become part of Angela's program. "I know some people think I should just disappear and hope everyone forgets what I did," Sullivan said when Angela asked him to address the group. "But Director Morrison helped me understand that hiding from my mistakes won't help anyone." The room was packed with people from all walks of life. There were police officers from several local departments, community activists, religious leaders, and ordinary residents who wanted to be part of the solution. Angela had insisted that any changes needed to come from the ground up, with input from everyone affected by policing practices. "When Officer Sullivan pulled me over that day, I had a choice," Angela told the group. "I could have used my position to destroy his career and move on. But that wouldn't have changed anything for the next person who gets stopped for driving while black in a nice neighborhood." The program Angela had developed was comprehensive and practical. Police officers went through extensive bias training that used real scenarios and community input. They learned to recognize their own unconscious prejudices and develop strategies for making decisions based on actual behavior rather than assumptions. But the training was just the beginning. The Community Trust Initiative also created ongoing partnerships between police and community members. Officers were required to spend time in the neighborhoods they patrolled, not just responding to calls, but actually getting to know residents and building relationships. Officer Rodriguez, Sullivan's former partner, had become one of the program's strongest supporters. "I've been a cop for 8 years, and I thought I was doing everything right," he told the group. "But watching what happened that day made me realize I needed to examine my own biases too." Rodriguez had volunteered to lead bias training sessions for other officers, sharing his experience and helping his colleagues understand How easily good intentions could be undermined by unconscious prejudices, the most innovative part of Angela's program was the accountability component. Community members were trained to serve as civilian observers during police encounters, providing an extra layer of oversight while also helping to mediate conflicts before they escalated. Mrs. Chun, a retired teacher who lived 2 blocks from where Angela had been stopped, had become one of these civilian observers. At first, I was nervous about getting involved, she admitted, but I realized that staying silent makes me part of the problem. The Civilian Observer Program had already prevented several potentially problematic encounters. When officers knew that trained community members might be watching and documenting their actions, they were more likely to follow proper procedures and treat people with respect. Angela had also worked with the police department to implement new policies about traffic stops. Officers were now required to document the specific reasons for any stop, and supervisors reviewed these reports regularly to identify patterns that might indicate bias. The changes weren't just happening in Maple Ridge. Angela's program had attracted attention from police departments and civil rights organizations across the country. She'd been invited to speak at conferences, and several other cities had requested help implementing similar initiatives. What makes this program different is that it's not just about punishment, explained Dr. Johnson, a criminology professor who had helped design the training curriculum. It's about creating sustainable change through education, accountability, and genuine community partnership. Officer Sullivan's transformation had been one of the most dramatic aspects of the entire program. Initially resistant and defensive, he'd gradually come to understand the impact of his actions not just on Angela, but on the broader community. I spent 15 years thinking I was a good cop because I caught criminals and kept people safe, Sullivan said during one of the group discussions. But I never thought about the people I might have hurt along the way, the trust I might have damaged with my assumptions and prejudices. Sullivan had become a powerful advocate for change within his own department. His willingness to admit his mistakes and work toward solutions had encouraged other officers to examine their own practices and biases. The program hadn't been without challenges. Some officers resisted the changes, arguing that the new procedures slowed down their work or made them second-guess legitimate police actions. Some community members remained skeptical, doubting that real change was possible, but the results spoke for themselves. Complaints about racial profiling in Maple Ridge had dropped by 70% in just 3 months. More importantly, surveys showed that community trust in police had increased significantly, particularly among minority residents. Angela looked around the room at the faces of people who had come together to create something positive from a terrible experience. There was Mrs. Patterson, who had transformed from an angry bystander into a community leader. There was Officer Rodriguez, who had become a champion for reform within his department. And there was Sullivan, who had gone from being part of the problem to becoming an essential part of the solution. Change is hard work, Angela told the group as the evening wound down. It would have been easier for all of us to just move on and pretend that day never happened. But real change requires us to face uncomfortable truths and do the difficult work of building something better. As people began to leave, Sullivan approached Angela. The conversation they had was brief but meaningful, filled with the kind of mutual respect that seemed impossible just months earlier. "Director Morrison, I know I can never undo what I did to you that day," Sullivan said. "But I want you to know that this program has changed, not just how I do my job, but who I am as a person." Angela nodded, seeing in Sullivan's eyes the genuine transformation that had taken place. "That's exactly what we hoped would happen, Officer Sullivan. And your willingness to change gives me hope for communities everywhere." Driving home that night, Angela reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this point. The incident that could have destroyed careers and divided communities had instead become the foundation for something unprecedented, a model for healing, accountability, and genuine progress in police-community relations. The work was far from finished, but Angela knew they had created something that could outlast any individual and continue making a difference for generations to come.